Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. Today we're going to talk about the documentary, the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson, and this is like the holy grail for Beatle fans. And in this episode, we're just going to start talking about part one of the documentary and just go through some highlights of the show. It sure was a great show to watch, and I'm so glad that I got a chance to see it. But let's get started. Last month, Beatle fans finally got to see the film by Peter Jackson that was hyped up so much the year before. The COVID virus put the brakes on the film in the year 2020, and it was supposed to be in the theaters by September. The anticipation of it was amplified by the time it ended up being on the Disney Plus app. Well, this could have been a blessing in disguise, because had it been shown in the theater, the fan and viewer would have only seen like 2.5 hours of the documentary. Instead, the Beatle fan was given 3 nights of the greatest band ever, and Get Back gives us 6 wonderful hours and unlimited opportunity to watch the show being on the Disney Channel. But in this episode, I'll go over the highlights of part 1 of the documentary. The documentary was recorded in 1969 by filmmakers, and they got over 57 hours of footage. Luckily, the director of Let It Be, Michael Lindsay Hogg, decided to save all the film he had shot. Michael decided to take his documentary into the drama side, where he highlighted negative moments, and the whole documentary felt a little bit deflated. Peter Jackson got a chance to make his own documentary from the footage, and he decided not to take anything that Michael used in his documentary of Let It Be. Now we have 2 sides of the coin, different perspectives that go well together, so the viewer can see that there just wasn't one side of black or white, but shades of gray. First up, we're going to talk about the calendar part of the movie. I loved how Peter Jackson used the calendar to show just how much time the band had to write, record, and prepare for a live show, as well as an album. And we all know how time flies, and it really does when you have to get something done in a certain amount of time. I was starting to feel nervous for them because it didn't seem like enough time to get all the things done that they wanted to achieve. The stress was there because they didn't know what the show was going to be. They just kept going over ideas that no one was very committed to. Now I was surprised that John was all for doing a live show while the rest of the band didn't want to. It had been 3 years since they had done anything live, and I could see why they would have some apprehension. How would they do, and how would the fans, would they still like them playing live? Well, Paul was the one that I thought would want to go live. When he began Wings, he was all for touring around the colleges and doing live performances. And George, when he went out on his own, began to do the live shows. But for some reason, they felt a bit timid to do it while they were still Beatles. Paul states that the best bits of us have always been, and always will be, is when our backs are against the wall. And John states, all we got is us. And this film shows them pulling together, as they always have, to get the job done. The time crunch was mainly due to Ringo having to be available to shoot the movie he was in called The Magic Christian. Well, next let's talk about the studio that they used, called the studio of Twickenham. They decided to use the studio of Twickenham to record the album, and they were also going to shoot the TV special in it. The time crunch came when the movie Ringo was starring in, they needed the stage back on the last week of January to begin their movie. Michael Lindsay Hogg got to tape their rehearsals, and the rest is history. Well, let's say that the Twickenham studio, as we saw in the documentary, was enormous, and the band got in close together to try to make it feel more friendly. The bandmates all got together and decided that they didn't like the acoustics in the studio. George was asking John, where's the console and the 8-track? It isn't like the recording studio they were used to. And John said the studio is just to rehearse in. John didn't think it was acoustically a good place either, and John thought that they should rehearse in a room or in a corner. Paul gets together with the director and George Martin and discusses how they don't like the acoustics of the place. And George Martin was thinking of adding a big PA system just so they could get used to the live playing that they would be doing later. And Paul's torn and states that they could do it for a few days or maybe stay there. I could see why they didn't really care for the place. There was no warmth to it. It was just like an empty shell. They did put some color lights to shine on the wall to make the place more welcoming, but it still didn't have that comfy feel to it. Next is the flow of ideas for the album. 14 songs had to be written, and they needed to write songs that didn't rely on studio tricks, overdubs, or experimental sounds. At the first day, George was the first to arrive, then John and Yoko and Ringo. And John is first with his ideas on the road to Marrakesh. That song would be totally redone to I'm a Jealous Guy. And then he goes into the song Don't Let Me Down. It's this song that gets played a lot during the recording. Next, Paul shows up. They like to play the old songs, and some not their own, to help them find their groove together. And George is doing more inputs on this album, but at times Paul doesn't seem to be giving George his undivided attention, or maybe he's processing what he's suggesting. It's kind of hard to tell. And Paul, he's so musical, he has suggestions for everyone. He even tells Ringo how he wants the song to sound on the drums by doing the stuff like that. Next, we'll talk about the rehearsals. George seems to want to get down to business. He states maybe we should learn a few songs first. And Paul kicks it off with I Got a Feeling. And it's neat to see the bandmates looking at the person who created the song and to start to learn from him what the notes were that were needed and how to get the song rolling along. In this song, Paul shouts out music notes to get the performance going. And then he gets them to do another song, Two of Us. It's neat to see them play the song and then add the little tweaks to get it to sound like the song that they have in their head regarding it. Then they show Ringo at the piano doing a song, Taking a Trip to Carolina. Paul and George sit with them while Ringo plays, and the guys are having fun and sharing some laughs together. The next song they do is One After 909. I love this song, and so do the Beatles. It's that old-time rock and roll that they love so much, and it's a song that they perform in the beginning of their years together. They do a version of Obla Di Obla Da, which was nothing like it was to be on the album that they placed it on. It wasn't on the Let It Be album. And it's neat to see John enjoying playing the guitar, and I didn't realize he was as good as he was. Next, they do a song that doesn't end up on the album, I'm So Tired. And this time, Paul's singing it instead of John, which is cool to hear. But I think they're singing that song because it was getting later in the afternoon, and by that time, they were all tired for real. And Paul starts his next song, which will become a hit, with the song Get Back. It's neat to see him work through it with the guitar playing and no real words, just grooving and making it happen. And then you say George Harrison's not feeling it for a little while. It seems like George was going through some marital problems around this time, and this probably made him feel more sensitive than he probably would have felt about how the rehearsals were going. George just wanted to get things going on so he could learn the songs, and George felt that he wasn't as great as improvising as Eric Clapton was, and he wanted to be a better player. George is feeling anxious, and he asks what the day is. Paul says that it's 12 days before they have to do the show. And then George says that they only have run through 4 songs and they haven't learned any of them yet. The friction comes momentarily when George and Paul have different ideas about how the song should be created. It was probably the stress of the time constraints and that there wasn't much time left to get it done. George just wanted to keep working on one song and getting it perfected, while Paul wanted to go on simply and then fill the songs in with more complex music suggestions. George felt like he wasn't able to create that way, and he wanted to get his parts down then and there. I think Paul wasn't used to George being so vocal about what he wanted, and John was being quiet and letting them sort it out. And then John later wisely says, let's improvise it. George then, by the end of the show, part 1 states that he's leaving the band. He says it quietly, but he has everyone's attention. And later, when the rest of the band return, they're feeling out of sorts. And who wouldn't be? Paul at first asked, I don't know why we're coming back here. And then John said it's just to pretend that nothing happened. And then they start playing and acting up just to get their emotions out. Well, the live show ideas, the director wanted to do an outdoor concert. And Paul said he wouldn't mind except for the cold and the possibility of snow or rain. And then you could get your hand would be kind of frozen out there in the cold, so it kind of makes it hard to play a chord. In this scene, Paul seems to be the spokesperson for the band, and when the idea is brought up to play in an amphitheater in Libya, Paul quickly states that Ringo doesn't want to go abroad. He also jokes that maybe Jimmy Nichols would want to go abroad, They used him when Ringo was too sick to go on tour. And George Harrison wanted them to do a few older Beatles songs for the show instead of just leaping into new songs. The director stated about doing a show at a hospital or an orphanage, but given the looks that he was getting, especially from John, that didn't go over very well. Paul said that he didn't feel any enthusiasm, and if they had, that would help. And George said that since Mr. Epstein passed away, they lost their enthusiasm. He later says maybe they should have a divorce, and Paul said it's getting nearer to that. John tried to keep things light by saying who would get the children. Ringo wanted to do the live show at the Cavern, and that would have been a neat idea. And later, Paul McCartney does go back to the Cavern to do a performance there, and I'm so glad he did. Okay, Yoko, we see that Yoko's just there to be a companion for John, and she finds things to do like read or paint or eat while the band creates. So it wasn't like she was creating any chaos or anything. She was just sitting there quietly most of the time, so I could see now that she really wasn't the cause of their breakup. It was years coming, and she just happened to be there, and somebody needed to have somebody to lash out at, I guess. So she was kind of the scapegoat for the fans at that time. And then there is little sparks of fun, so there is time for fun. The Beatles don't take things too seriously at times. They understand that to be creative, you can't keep trying to force things to happen. They get a laugh reading the magazines about them, and George compliments Paul, saying his beard suits him. And then there's Linda and Paul. Paul decides to have Linda there at the studio since Yoko was there, and you could tell they really love each other. The way Linda watches Paul, you can see she's very proud of him and how talented he is. And Linda gets a chance to take photographs, which is so good for the world to be able to see what was going on. And the first part of the documentary ends with Paul, John, Ringo, Yoko, and Maureen at the door, talking things over. Mainly it's Paul, John, and Ringo with Yoko and Maureen standing a little bit away from them. You can't hear what they're saying, and they do have a slight embrace. But the words at the end of the show say they decided to talk with George in order to get him to return with the band. And the first meeting didn't go so well, as reported on the documentary. I wish we could have seen what George was so upset about. It's sad to see how the band had sort of lost their mojo, but the first part of the documentary shows it wasn't just them not getting along, but also shows the process of how they created it, which is magical. It also showed that they still had camaraderie in spots, and that they were still trying hard to stay together. And next I'll do another video going over part 2 of the program and hitting highlights from that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you liked it, if you could give it a thumbs up or subscribe if you haven't already, that would be great. And thanks to all of you that have. It means a lot to me. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.